The shuttle docked with a deep metallic groan that Mara Voss felt in her teeth, and she grabbed the overhead rail as the landing clamps locked into place with a sound like thunder rolling through a steel canyon. She picked up her single bag and walked down the ramp into Station Voroth 9. It was enormous beyond anything she had seen before. A ring of metal and glass spinning slowly around a dead star, and the corridor ahead of her stretched so far into the distance that it vanished into a haze of pale blue light that made the air itself look cold. Cadets of a dozen species moved through the corridor in every direction, and not one of them looked like her. There were Grothar lumbering past on 4 thick legs, their rocky skins scraping the walls when they turned corners too fast, and there were Selvari gliding along in clusters, their translucent skin flickering with bioluminescent patterns that shifted like mood rings made of living light. And there were Thorani, standing head and shoulders above everyone else, forearms folded across armored chests, their chitinous plating clicking softly when they moved. Mara was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds, and she walked through all of them like she belonged there. A Selvari bumped into her at an intersection and immediately began apologizing in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a rainstorm. "I am so sorry. I did not see you there. You are very small. I mean no offense by that. It is simply an observation of—" "You're fine," Mara said, and kept walking. She found the barracks on Deck 14 and located her assigned bunk, a narrow shelf built into the wall with a thin mattress and a privacy screen that did not quite reach the ceiling. The bunk across from hers was already occupied by a Selvari, who was sitting cross-legged on the mattress, with a datapad balanced on her knees, and a look of deep concentration on her angular face. The Selvari looked up when Mara entered, and her skin flashed a quick pattern of pale green that Mara did not know how to read yet. "You are the human," the Selvari said. "One of them," Mara said, dropping her bag on the mattress. "I am Lirith," the Selvari said, and her skin shifted to a warmer color, something between gold and amber, that Mara guessed meant friendly. "I have read about your species, but I have never met one in person, and I have to say you are much smaller than I expected." "We get that a lot." Lirith leaned forward with the eager energy of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "Is it true that your bones break and then grow back stronger than before? More or less. Is it true that you can keep running for entire planetary rotations without stopping? If we have to. Is it true that your species used to chase animals across open terrain until the animals collapsed from exhaustion?" "Exhaustion, and died?" Mara paused in the middle of unpacking and looked at Lirith with something that was almost a smile. "That one is definitely true." Lirith's skin flickered rapidly through several colors at once, which Mara took to mean she was both fascinated and slightly horrified. "I think I am glad we are on the same side," Lirith said. They talked for a while as Mara settled in, and Lirith filled her in on the things the orientation packet had not mentioned, like which mess hall had the best food, and which corridors to avoid after dark, and which instructors were fair, and which ones were not. When Mara asked about the combat training program, Lirith's skin went a shade of blue so deep it was almost purple. "The combat instructor is Sergeant Kale Drovan," Lirith said, and her voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "He is Thorani, and he is the worst one." "Worst how?" "He is brilliant, and he is brutal, and he does not believe that any species without natural armor deserves to be in his training pit," Lirith said. "He has washed out recruits from species much tougher than either of us, and he does not do it with cruelty exactly. He does it with contempt, which is somehow worse." Mara folded her empty bag and slid it under the mattress. "I've had tough instructors before." "Not like him," Lirith said, and her bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing. He looks at species like us, and he sees something that is already broken, something that is wasting his time by existing in his arena. Mara said nothing to that, and Lirith seemed to take her silence as concern. "I'm sorry. I do not mean to frighten you, I just want you to be prepared." "I appreciate it," Mara said, and there was a steadiness in her voice that made Lirith's skin flicker with a color she could not quite name, something between curiosity and the particular shade she associated with people who were not afraid when they probably should be. The next morning the cadets assembled in the main training hall on Deck 7, a cavernous space with a combat pit sunk into the center of the floor, and observation tiers rising around it in concentric rings. 200 cadets stood in formation, arranged by species and intake group, and the variety was staggering, a gallery of evolution's wildest experiments, all standing at attention in matching gray training uniforms that fit none of them particularly well. Mara stood in the human section, which consisted of herself and 11 others, a tiny cluster near the back that drew curious glances from every direction. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Sergeant Kale Drovan walked in. He was 7 feet 4 inches of Thorani warrior, forearms thick with corded muscle beneath plates of blue-gray chitin that covered his body like organic armor, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never, in his life, met anything he could not break. His eyes were black and multifaceted, like a predator insect scaled up to nightmare proportions, and they swept across the assembled cadets with the detached assessment of a butcher examining livestock. He walked the line slowly, passing the Grothar with a nod of acknowledgement, pausing briefly at the Selvari with visible disinterest, and stopping at each species long enough to make a judgment that everyone in the room could read on his face. Then he reached the humans. He stopped in front of Mara, who happened to be standing at the end of the row, and he looked down at her from a height that made the difference between them feel less like a gap and more like a geological feature. His mandibles clicked twice, which Mara had read was the Thorani equivalent of a dry laugh. "They are sending me hatchlings now," he said, and his voice was deep enough to vibrate in her chest like a second heartbeat. Looked up at him and said nothing. Her face was perfectly still, and her hands were loose at her sides, and her breathing was even. And if Drovan had known enough about humans to read those signs, he might have recognized them as the specific kind of calm that comes not from a lack of fear, but from a long and intimate familiarity with it. But he did not know humans, not yet, and so he simply moved on down the line and began his opening address about the standards he expected and the weakness he would not tolerate. Lierith caught Mara's eye from across the formation and flashed a worried shade of violet. Mara gave her the smallest nod. It was going to be fine. The combat pit was 30 meters across and sunk 2 meters into the floor, ringed by observation tiers that rose in steep steps all the way to the ceiling. And on the morning of the baseline evaluation, every seat was full. Cadets packed the tiers, shoulder to shoulder and tentacle to wing. Hundreds of eyes and sensory organs of every description all pointed downward at the pit, where Sergeant Drovan stood with a sensor pad in one of his 4 hands. The pad was a flat disc about the size of a dinner plate, made of reinforced composite material, designed to absorb and measure kinetic force, and it had survived impacts from species that could punch through starship bulkheads. Drovan held it up so the entire arena could see it. "This is simple," he said, and his deep voice carried easily through the acoustics of the pit without any amplification. "Each of you will step forward and deliver 1 strike to this pad, and the pad will measure your force output in standardized kinetic units, and that number will determine which training tier you are placed in for the remainder of your time at this academy." He let that sink in for a moment. Tier 1 is for elite combatants, Tier 2 is for advanced, Tier 3 is for standard, and Tier 4 is for those who need remedial conditioning before they can be trusted not to injure themselves in a real fight. A ripple of nervous energy moved through the tiers. One by one, the cadets descended into the pit and delivered their strikes. A Grothar went first and slammed a massive forelimb into the pad with a sound like a boulder hitting concrete, and the number that flashed on the overhead display was enormous and drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. A Thorani cadet followed and struck with 2 fists simultaneously, and the number was nearly as high, and Drovan gave a grunt of approval that was the most positive sound anyone had ever heard him make. Went next a 4-legged species with a whip-like tail tipped in hardened bone, and the crack of the tail against the pad echoed through the arena like a gunshot. And the number was impressive. Species after species stepped up, and the numbers ranged from staging to modest, and the crowd began to settle into a rhythm of expectation, cheering the high scores and going politely quiet for the low ones. The Selvari scored near the bottom, their delicate frames not built for raw power, and Lireth climbed back to her seat with her skin a dull, embarrassed gray. Then the display board showed the next name, and a hush rolled through the arena like a wave pulling back from shore. Voss, Mara, human, Earth. Mara walked down the steps into the pit with the same unhurried calm she carried everywhere, and the size of the arena around her made her look even smaller than she was, a single figure in gray, standing on the wide floor of the pit like a coin dropped on a landing pad. Drovan turned to face her and held the sensor pad out in his lower right hand, and his posture told the entire story of what he expected. His upper arms crossed over his chest, his weight shifted back on his heels, his multifaceted eyes half-lidded with the particular boredom of someone going through a formality. Mara stopped in front of the pad and set her feet. She took a breath, rotated her hips, and threw a straight right. Her fist connected with a clean, sharp sound, and the pad registered the impact, and the number appeared on the overhead display. It was low. It was not the lowest score of the day, but it was close, sitting well below the average for mid-tier species, and far beneath anything that would earn respect in this arena. Drovan looked at the number, and then looked down at Mara, and he chuckled. It was not a cruel sound exactly, but it was worse than cruel, because it was genuine. The honest, involuntary amusement of someone who had seen it all. Someone who had just had his lowest expectations confirmed. "Adequate for your species, I suppose," he said, loud enough for the entire arena to hear. And a few cadets in the upper tiers laughed. And somewhere in the crowd, Lirith pressed her hands over her face, and her skin went dark with second-hand shame. "You will be placed in Tier 4, Drovan continued, already turning away. "Remedial conditioning. Report to Training Room 12 tomorrow at—" "May I hit it again?" Drovan stopped and turned back, and his mandibles clicked in that dry laugh again. "The evaluation is 1 strike, Private." "I understand that," Mara said, and her voice was level and unhurried, and carried no emotion that anyone in the arena could identify. "I am asking if I may hit it again." Drovan studied her for a moment with those black compound eyes, and whatever he saw in her face amused him enough to grant the request. He held the pad out again with the lazy confidence of someone offering a toy to a child. "If it makes you feel better," he said. Mara reset her stance. Lireth was watching from the tiers, with her fingers still half covering her face, and later she would describe what she saw next as something she did not have adequate language for, like watching a star go from dim to blinding in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Something changed in Mara. It was not visible in any dramatic way. There was no battle cry, no surge of obvious fury, no transformation that the uninitiated eye could easily name. But something in the quality of her stillness shifted from passive to active, from waiting to choosing, and the air around her seemed to tighten like a wire being drawn taut. She threw the same punch, same arm, same angle, same straight right. But this time, the movement was different in every way that mattered. This time, her feet drove into the floor, and the force traveled up through her legs. And her hips rotated with a mechanical precision that looked almost engineered, and her core tightened and her shoulder rolled forward, and every single link in the chain from the ground to her knuckles fired in perfect sequence, like a series of controlled detonations. Her fist hit the pad, and the sound was different. It was not the clean, sharp tap of before. It was a deep, concussive crack that echoed off the walls of the pit, and made several cadets in the front row flinch. Drovan felt it travel up his arm and into his shoulder, and he took a half-step back before he could stop himself. And he looked down at the pad and saw a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface from the point of impact. The number appeared on the overhead display. The arena went silent. It was 3 times higher than her first strike, sitting comfortably in the mid-range of Tier 2, competitive with species that outweighed her by hundreds of kilograms. Weapons built into their bodies. 200 cadets stared at the number, and then stared at the small human woman standing in the pit, with her fists still extended, and not a single sign of strain on her face. Drovan stared at the cracked pad in his hand. His chuckle was gone. The amusement was gone. In its place was something that his species did not experience often: the sudden and uncomfortable awareness of having made a serious miscalculation. Mara lowered her fist and looked up at him with eyes that were calm and clear, and absolutely without apology. "Humans do not show you what we can do," she said, and her voice carried through the silent arena as clearly as if she were speaking into every ear at once. "We show you what we choose to." She turned and walked back up the steps to the observation tier without waiting for a response. The arena stayed silent for a long time. Lyrith's skin was cycling through colors so fast, she looked like a broken signal light. And when Mara sat down beside her, the Selvari opened her mouth and closed it and opened it again. "What," Lyrith finally managed, "was that?" Mara flexed her right hand once, and if the knuckles ached, she gave no sign of it. "That was the introduction," she said. Down in the pit, Drovan set the cracked sensor pad on the ground and stood very still for a moment. And then he called the next cadet forward in a voice that had lost something it had carried all morning. The cadets who went after Mara delivered their strikes to a brand new pad because the old one was no longer functional. That night, Sergeant Drovan sat alone in his office on Deck 9, with the lights dimmed to a level that would have been total darkness for most species, but was comfortable for Thorani eyes. And he pulled up Private Mara Voss's file on his terminal and began to read. He read it once, and then he read it again, and then he opened the Coalition Xenobiology database and searched for the entry on humans, and read that too. And what he found there kept him in his chair for 3 hours longer than he had intended to stay. The Thorani were a proud species, and they had earned that pride through millennia of warfare and conquest. And Drovan had spent his entire career confident in the knowledge that his people sat near the top of the galactic hierarchy of physical capability. He had fought Grothar and matched them. He had sparred with Kelvari and bested them. And he had trained cadets from 40 different species over 20 years without once encountering anything that truly surprised him. The human file surprised him. It started with the basics that he already knew: that humans were a young species from a mid-gravity world with a single star, that they had achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago, and had made first contact with the Coalition only 30 years before that, that they were classified as a Class 3 endurance species with moderate strength and no natural armor or weapons. But then the file went deeper, and the deeper it went, the more Drovan felt something cold and unfamiliar settling into the base of his skull. The first thing that caught his attention was the section on human adrenal response. Every species in the galaxy had some form of stress hormone, some chemical mechanism that activated during danger and enhanced performance for short periods. But the human version was something else entirely. The human adrenal system could flood the body with a cocktail of chemicals that temporarily suppressed pain reception, increased blood flow to the muscles, heightened sensory awareness, and pushed strength output well beyond baseline levels. And the truly disturbing part was that trained humans could trigger this response voluntarily. They could choose to activate it. They could stand in front of a threat with their heart rate steady and their breathing even, and then simply decide to become more dangerous, like flipping a switch that most species did not even know existed. Drovan thought about the moment in the pit when Mara had asked to hit the pad again, and he thought about the shift he had sensed in her before the second strike. And he realized with a cold clarity that he had watched her flip that switch in real time. The second thing that shook him was the section on human biomechanics. The Thorani generated force through mass and density, their chitinous plating adding weight to every blow, and most heavy species operated the same way. Their size as a multiplier. Humans did not have that luxury, so they had found another way. The human musculoskeletal system was built around a principle that the file called elastic energy storage, which meant that human tendons functioned like biological springs, absorbing force during the loading phase of a movement, and then releasing it explosively during the strike. Combined with rotational joints at the hips and shoulders that allowed the entire body to contribute to a single point of impact, a trained human could generate force that was wildly disproportionate to their body mass. This was why Mara's second punch had registered 3 times higher than her first. She had not somehow become 3 times stronger between one strike and the next. She had simply used her body the way it was designed to be used, instead of holding back. And that led Drovan to the third revelation, the one that made him sit very still in his chair for a long time. Bodies adapted to damage. When a human bone fractured, it healed back denser and harder than before. And when human muscle fibers tore from exertion, they rebuilt themselves thicker and more resilient. And this process was not a one-time event. It was continuous. It happened every single day of a human's life, in response to the stresses they placed on themselves. Humans had built entire training philosophies around this principle, deliberately pushing their bodies to the point of breakdown so that the rebuilding process would make them stronger. And they had been refining these methods for thousands of years across hundreds of martial traditions on a planet where they had spent most of their history fighting each other. Drovan closed the file and stared at the dark wall of his office. He had chuckled at her. He had stood in front of a species that could voluntarily override its own safety limiters, generate force through biomechanical leverage that defied its size class, and literally become physically harder to damage the more punishment it absorbed. And he had chuckled. Over the following weeks, Drovan placed Mara in Tier 2 as her score demanded, and he watched her from the observation tier with an attention he had never given any single cadet before. She lost her first sparring match against a Kelvari who outweighed her by 90 kilograms, and the Kelvari put her on the ground with a tail strike that cracked one of her ribs, and Mara got up and finished the round and lost on points. 3 days later she fought the same Kelvari again, and she lost again, but by a smaller margin, and this time she did not go down once. A week after that she fought the Kelvari a third time, and she won, because by then she had learned the timing of the tail strike, and she had developed a counter for it that involved stepping inside the arc and delivering a rapid combination to the joint where the tail met the body. Had been fighting with that tail his entire life. Could not understand how a creature who had only encountered the technique 3 weeks ago could have already solved it. Mara's bunkmate Lirith had begun keeping a journal of observations, partly out of scientific curiosity and partly out of the particular fascination that comes from watching something you do not fully understand. "How do you keep getting up?" Lirith asked one evening, after Mara had returned from a sparring session, with bruises covering her arms, and a cut above her left eye that she had closed with adhesive strips from the first aid kit, instead of going to the medical bay. Mara was sitting on her bunk, stretching her shoulders with the mechanical patience of someone performing a ritual she had performed 10,000 times before. "Getting up is the easy part," Mara said. "Staying up is where it gets interesting." "But the pain," Lirith said, and her skin was a troubled shade of deep blue. "The Kelvari hit you 6 times today, and any one of those strikes would have put me in the medical wing for a week. How are you not in the medical wing right now?" Mara considered the question for a moment. "On Earth we have a saying," she said. "What does not kill you makes you stronger. And for most species in the galaxy, I think that is just a nice thought. A piece of philosophy that sounds good, but does not mean anything real." She rolled her shoulder and winced slightly, and then continued stretching as if the wince had not happened. "For humans it is not philosophy," she said. "It is biology. My bones are already denser than they were when I arrived here. The muscles in my right arm have rebuilt themselves to handle impact forces that would have damaged them 3 weeks ago. And the neural pathways that control my reaction time have been sharpened by every single fight I have had in this place." Lirith stared at her with wide, luminous eyes. "Saying that losing is making you stronger. I am saying that everything makes us stronger," Mara said. "Winning, losing, getting hit, getting back up, pain, fatigue, fear, all of it. Our bodies take damage and rebuild better. Our minds take failure and adapt faster. It is not magic, and it is not willpower alone. It is what we are made of." Lirith was quiet for a long time after that, her skin shifting slowly through colors that Mara had learned to associate with deep thought. "I think," Lirith said finally, "that the galaxy made a mistake by not paying more attention to your species." Mara smiled, which was something she did rarely enough that Lirith noticed it every time. "The galaxy is starting to pay attention now," she said. Up on Deck 9, Drovan pulled up the combat statistics from the past 3 weeks and tracked Mara's performance curve on a graph. And the line went up at an angle that he had never seen from any species in 20 years of training. He saved the graph, and closed his terminal, and sat in the dark for a while. He was not worried exactly. But he was no longer amused. The quarterly combat tournament at Vorath 9 was not technically mandatory, but every cadet understood that refusing to enter was the same as announcing to the entire station that you did not belong there. And so, when the sign-up boards went live on a Monday morning, the names filled in fast. There were 3 brackets: species class, which matched fighters of similar biology; weight class, which matched fighters of similar mass; and open class, which had no restrictions of any kind, and was considered by most cadets to be a polite way of describing organized violence. Mara signed up for open class. Lirith found out when she saw the bracket posted on the training hall wall, and her skin went a shade of white so pure it was almost luminous. "You cannot be serious," Lirith said. "I am always serious," Mara said. "Mara, the open class bracket has a Grothar in it, Torek, the one who cracked the training pit floor last month by stepping too hard. 100 pounds, and his skin is made of actual stone." "I know who Torek is." "Then you know that fighting him is not a test of skill. It is a test of whether your skeleton can survive being hit by a small vehicle." Mara looked at Lirith with an expression that was calm and patient and completely immovable. "I did not come to this station to fight in the easy bracket," she said. The tournament drew the largest crowd the arena had seen all year, cadets and instructors, and even some off-duty station personnel, filling the observation tiers until there was standing room only along the back walls. Mara's first 2 fights were against mid-tier opponents, a Selvari heavy variant who fought with speed and precision, and a Kalvari who relied on reach and tail strikes. She won both, and she won them the same way, not by overpowering her opponents, but by surviving the first exchange, reading their patterns, finding the gap, and then exploiting it with a speed and accuracy that made the crowd go quiet, in the particular way that crowds go quiet when they are watching something they do not fully understand. By the time her third match was announced, the arena was buzzing with a nervous electric energy that Lirith could feel on her skin like static. Voss, Mara versus Torek. The Grothar entered the pit from the far side, and the floor vibrated with each step, and he was everything Lirith had described and more. A mountain of living rock on 4 thick legs, with forelimbs like battering rams, and a head that was mostly jaw and armored plate. He looked at Mara the way a boulder might look at a leaf. Mara entered from the near side, and she looked exactly the way she always looked, small and still, and breathing evenly. And she set her feet and raised her hands and waited. The signal sounded. Torek came forward fast, faster than anything his size should have been able to move, and he led with a sweeping forelimb. That cut through the air, with a sound like a heavy door being slammed. Mara ducked under it, and moved to his flank, and landed 2 quick strikes to the joint where his forward leg met his body. And the hits landed clean, but the sound they made against his stone skin was like knocking on a wall, and Torek did not even flinch. He turned and swung again, and this time Mara was not quite fast enough. His forelimb caught her across the ribs on her left side, and the impact lifted her off her feet and sent her sliding across the pit floor. And the sound of the hit reached the upper tiers a fraction of a second later. A heavy, wet crack that made Lirith's entire body flash white with fear. The medical officer at the edge of the pit stood up and raised the stop signal. Mara was already getting back to her feet. She waved the medical officer off with her left hand, while her right arm pressed against her ribs, where something was clearly broken, and she straightened up and set her feet again, and raised her hands again. The arena murmured. Torek looked at her with what might have been confusion. His species did not have very expressive faces, but his posture shifted slightly, the way a predator's posture shifts when prey does something unexpected. He came forward again. The next 3 minutes were the longest of Lirith's life. Torek hit Mara 4 more times, not full-force impacts like the first one, but glancing blows and clipping strikes that would have ended the fight for any other species in her weight class. And each time, Mara went back, or went sideways, or went down, and each time she got back up. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead where one of his strikes had grazed her skull, and she was favoring her left side where the broken ribs were making every breath a decision, and her right knee had taken a hit that made her limp slightly when she moved to the left. But she kept moving, and she was. That was the part that made the arena go from murmuring to silent. The visible, real-time evidence that this human being was taking damage and processing it, and adapting her strategy between one heartbeat and the next. After the third hit, she stopped trying to strike his body entirely and began targeting his joints exclusively, the narrow gaps between the plates of rock, where the flesh was softer and the nerve clusters were closer to the surface. After the fourth hit, she changed her footwork to stay on his right side, where his turning radius was wider and his forelimb reach was shorter. After the fifth hit, she began using his own momentum against him, stepping just far enough to make him overcommit, and then punishing the opening with rapid targeted strikes to the same joint over and over again. Torek began to slow down. Not from exhaustion. Grothar had enormous stamina reserves, but from something else, something that his species had a word for, but rarely experienced: uncertainty. He had hit this creature 6 times, and she was still standing. And not just standing, but fighting back with increasing effectiveness. And every time he looked at her face, he saw the same expression he had seen at the start of the fight, calm and focused and absolutely without any indication that she intended to stop. For the first time in the tournament, Torek felt something he had never felt in a combat pit before. He felt doubt. Mara saw it. Later she would not be able to explain exactly how she saw it, whether it was something in his posture, or his timing, or the way his forelimb hesitated for a fraction of a second before his next swing. But she saw the moment his certainty cracked, and she moved. She stepped inside his reach, closer than she had been the entire fight, close enough to smell the mineral dust that came off his skin, and she planted her feet and unleashed a combination that she had been building toward since the first minute. 3 strikes to the same point on the left side of his neck, where the armored plates were thinnest, each one building on the micro-damage of the one before, each one driven by the full rotational force of her hips and the elastic snap of tendons that were designed by evolution to do exactly this. The first strike cracked the plate. The second strike widened the crack. The third strike drove through. Torek made a sound that the arena had never heard a Grothar make, a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the floor, and his front legs buckled, and he went down on one knee, and then the other, and the pit shook with the impact of 900 pounds hitting the ground. The arena did not make a sound. 200 cadets sat in absolute stillness, staring at the impossible thing that had just happened in front of them. A human woman standing over a fallen Grothar, with blood running down her face, and her ribs broken. Her knees swollen to twice its normal size, breathing hard, but still on her feet. Still on her feet. Mara looked down at Torek, and for a moment, the only sound in the arena was her breathing and the faint groan of the Grothar's settling weight against the floor. Then she reached out her hand. Torek looked up at her, and whatever he saw in her face was not triumph or contempt or any of the things he had seen in the faces of opponents who had beaten him in the past. It was respect. He took her hand, and she helped him up, or tried to, since he weighed nearly 7 times what she did, but the gesture itself was what mattered, and when he was on his feet again, he looked out at her and dipped his head in the Grothar gesture of acknowledgement that was reserved for worthy opponents. The arena exploded. Cadets surged to their feet across every tier, and the sound was a wall of noise that hit Mara like a physical force, and Lireth was somewhere in the middle of it, with her skin blazing through every color she had ever produced, screaming in a register that only Selvari ears could fully appreciate. Mara stood in the center of the pit and let the sound wash over her, and she swayed slightly on her feet, and for just a moment her eyes lost focus, and she looked like what she was, a small, injured human being who had pushed herself far past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped. Then she steadied herself and walked out of the pit on her own 2 feet, because that was what humans did. Up in the observation tier, Sergeant Kale Dravon watched her go with all 4 arms folded across his chest, and his expression carved from something harder and more permanent than his chitin. He did not cheer. He did not speak. He nodded, once, slow, with the weight of a verdict being delivered, and then he turned and left the arena before anyone could see the look on his face, which was the look of someone who had just realized that everything he thought he knew about the galaxy's hierarchy needed to be rewritten. Mara showed up to combat class the next morning, at exactly the scheduled time, with her ribs taped under her training uniform, and bruises running from her jaw to her hip, in shades of purple and yellow, and a limp that she did not bother trying to hide. Every other cadet who had taken comparable damage in the tournament was in the medical wing, and would remain there for days, some of them for weeks, and the medical staff had told Mara the same thing when she had stopped by at dawn to have her ribs rewrapped. "You should be in a bed," the Selvari medic had told her, pressing careful fingers against the swelling around her knee. "I should be in class," Mara had said, and the medic had looked at her with that particular expression that medical professionals across the galaxy shared when a patient was being unreasonable. and then the medic had wrapped her ribs tighter and let her go. Now she stood in the front row of the combat class, with 200 cadets behind her. And Sergeant drove on in front of her, and every eye in the room was on one of them. Drovan let the silence build. He stood in the center of the pit with all 4 arms at his sides, which was unusual, because he almost always stood with at least 2 of them crossed. And his posture was different from any other morning, less rigid, less performative, more like someone who was about to say something he had never said before and was taking a moment to find the exact right words. "Today's session will begin with a lecture," he said, and a ripple of surprise moved through the cadets, because Drovan did not give lectures. Drovan gave instructions and criticisms, and occasionally grudging acknowledgments. But lectures were not part of his method. "In my career I have served the Coalition for 26 years, he began, and his voice was lower than usual. Not the booming command voice he used in training, but something closer to the tone that Thorani used when they spoke to equals. "I have fought in 9 major conflicts across 4 sectors. I have engaged in hand-to-hand combat with over 30 different species, and I have trained cadets from more worlds than most of you will ever visit." He paused and let his black compound eyes sweep across the assembled cadets. "Based on that experience, I have maintained a personal ranking of the most dangerous species in this galaxy, a list that I have refined over decades and that I have always considered to be accurate and complete." Another pause. That list changed yesterday. The arena was so quiet that Lyrith could hear the hum of the station's atmospheric processors 3 decks above them. Drovan turned to face Mara directly, and for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, he looked at her not as something small that he was forced to accommodate, but as something that had earned the full weight of his attention. "When Private Voss first struck my sensor pad 8 weeks ago," he said, "I measured her by the number that appeared on the display, and I found that number lacking, and I laughed." He said it flatly, without shame or defensiveness, the way a soldier states a tactical error in an after-action report. "That was the single greatest mistake of assessment I have made in my career, and I have made it because I did something that no competent warrior should ever do. I measured what a human is, instead of measuring what a human decides to be." He turned back to the full assembly. "Every species in this galaxy is defined by its biology. The Thorani are strong because our chitin is dense and our muscles are thick. The Grothar are powerful because their stone skin makes them nearly indestructible. The Kelvari are dangerous because their tails can shatter bone. We are what evolution made us, and we fight with the tools we were born with." His mandibles clicked once, not in amusement this time, but in something that sounded almost like frustration. Frustration directed at himself. Humans are different, not because their bodies are superior. They are not. A human is smaller than a Thorani, and softer than a Grothar, and slower than a Kelvari. By every standard metric of physical capability, humans are a mid-tier species at best. He let that statement hang in the air. But humans have something that I have not encountered in any other species in 26 years of service. They have a limiter. A biological mechanism that restricts their output to a fraction of what they are capable of, and they can choose to remove it. He began to pace, which was something he never did during instruction, and the cadets watched him with the focused attention of people who understood they were hearing something important. "When Private Voss struck my pad the first time, she was operating within her limiter. She was showing me what a human looks like when it is being careful, holding itself back to avoid self-injury, and I saw that, and I thought I understood what humans were." He stopped pacing. "When she struck it the second time, she removed the limiter, and the pad broke, and I realized that I had never understood anything at all." He turned to face the class again, and his voice took on the hard edge of a lesson being driven home. "In the tournament yesterday, you all watched Private Voss fight an opponent who outweighed her by a factor of 7. An opponent whose body is literally made of stone. and you watched her take damage that would have ended the fight for any other species in her weight class, and you watched her refuse to stop. That refusal is not stubbornness, it is not recklessness, and it is not a lack of intelligence. It is the defining characteristic of the human species, the ability to take everything that the universe throws at them, and choose, consciously and deliberately, to keep going, break and heal back harder. Their muscles tear and rebuild stronger. Their minds take failure and turn it into adaptation. And none of this happens by accident. It happens because humans have spent their entire evolutionary history on a world that was actively trying to kill them. And they responded not by growing armor or claws or venom, but by developing the ability to simply refuse to be beaten. He walked to the edge of the pit and looked up at the observation tiers where the cadets sat in perfect silence. I have fought Grothar who could crush me. I have sparred with Kelvari who were faster than me. I have faced opponents from species that evolution designed specifically for combat. And I respected them all, but I was never uncertain about the outcome. His gaze settled on Mara, who stood in the front row with her taped ribs and her bruised face and her swollen knee, standing at attention, as if none of it mattered. Yesterday was the first time in my career that I watched a fight and felt uncertain, not because the human was stronger or faster or tougher than the Grothar. She was none of those things. But because I realized that I could not calculate the upper limit of what she was willing to endure. And a warrior whose limits you cannot calculate is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. He straightened to his full height, and his voice shifted back to the command register that filled the arena without effort. Private Voss, step forward. Mara walked into the pit and stood at attention before him, and the size difference between them was still enormous, but somehow it did not look the same as it had on the first day. Somehow the gap between 7 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches seemed less like a geological feature and more like an irrelevant detail. Effective immediately, you are promoted to Tier 1, Elite Training Cadre, Drovan said. You are the first human in the history of this academy to earn that rank. That designation, Mara saluted in the human fashion, which was a gesture Drovan had never been saluted with before. And he returned it with a Thorani salute, all 4 fists pressed to his chest, which was a gesture reserved for warriors of proven worth. The arena erupted for the second time in 2 days, and this time even the Thorani cadets joined in, their chitinous plates clicking in the rhythmic pattern that was their species' equivalent of applause. That evening, long after the classes had ended and the corridors had gone quiet with the artificial night cycle of the station, Lireth found Mara sitting on her bunk in the barracks, with the privacy screen pulled halfway across. Mara was peeling off the adhesive tape around her ribs with slow, careful movements, and her face was doing something that Lireth had never seen it do before. It was wincing, openly and without any attempt to hide it, the private expression of pain that Mara had kept locked behind her. Calm exterior for every moment she had spent in public. "Oh," Lirith said softly, and her skin dimmed to a gentle, concerned blue. "I can come back." "No, sit down," Mara said, and she pulled the last strip of tape free and let out a breath that shook slightly at the edges. "I could use the company." Lirith sat on her own bunk across the narrow gap and watched Mara inspect the bruising along her left side, a mottled landscape of purple and black that looked like a map of some violent and beautiful territory. "Are you all right?" Lirith asked. Mara laughed. It was soft and short and slightly ragged around the edges, but it was a real laugh, the first one Lirith had ever heard from her, and it transformed her face in a way that made Lirith understand for the first time that Mara Voss was not just a soldier or a fighter or a representative of her species. She was a person, a young woman a very long way from home who had just done something extraordinary, and was now sitting on a thin mattress in her underwear, trying not to cry when she breathed too deeply. "I am sore in places I did not know I had," Mara said, "and I think my knee is going to be a problem for a while. And I am reasonably sure that at least 2 of my ribs are going to heal slightly crooked." "But are you all right?" Mara looked at Lirith and smiled. And it was a real smile, tired and warm and human in a way that no xenobiology textbook could ever capture. "Yeah, Lirith, I am all right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that exists between people who have moved past the need to fill every moment with words. And through the viewport at the end of the barracks, the stars turned slowly as the station rotated. Thousands of points of light representing thousands of worlds that were only just beginning to learn what humanity was. "Was it worth it?" Lirith asked quietly. Mara looked out at the stars for a moment. "Long time," before she answered. 30 years ago, nobody out here knew what a human was," she said. "Now they do." Lirith's skin shifted through several colors and settled on a shade she had never produced before. Something warm and bright and steady, the color of someone who had found a new definition of courage and was still getting used to how it felt. She looked at the small, bruised, impossibly stubborn human sitting across from her. This person who had walked onto a station full of species that could crush her, and had answered every doubt with the same quiet refusal to be less than what she chose to be. And Lirith thought, in the private space of her own mind, where the colors of her skin could not betray her, that if this was what humanity was, then the galaxy had better start paying very close attention. Because they were only getting started, and they were only going to get stronger.